Hello, and thanks for joining me today. My name is Jeph, and you're listening to episode 27 of the Comic Book of the Day podcast. Hello, good morning. Welcome to another edition of our daily podcast about comic books, which is appropriately titled the Comic Book of the Day podcast. My name is Jeph, and our Comic Book of the Day today was published by Marvel Comics. It was published this issue. Oh, so this is interesting. This issue was published in 2015. Actually, this was published in November of 2015. This is issue 1 of Captain America White. This is by Jeph Loeb and Tim Sale. This was originally part of a 5-issue series, it's a 5-issue limited series by Marvel. But the interesting thing is that this actually was originally, there was a preview comic that was published, Captain America White Zero. So this is part of an ongoing pairing of Jeph Loeb and Tim Sale. And I don't know how much you follow comics, but I think if you were to write down some of the great duos in history, in comic book history rather, if you were to talk about some of the great writer and artist collaborations, you'd have your John Burns and Chris Claremonts, you'd have your Frank Miller and Lynn Varleys, you'd have your Jeph Loeb and Tim Sale. They would absolutely, unequivocally, is that how you pronounce that? Absolutely, without a doubt, they would be on that top 3 or top 5. You've got your Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams. You've got your Jeph Loeb and Tim Sale, and I absolutely don't have any reservations about mentioning those two in the same sentence as any of the other legendary creators, Simon and Kirby, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Loeb is an absolutely astonishing storyteller, and Tim Sale is just brilliant in how he tells a story. I think, if the title of this book is Captain America White, and it follows in a series of books called, I've heard them called various names. I've heard them called the Marvel Knights Color series. I've heard them called the Color books, the Color stories. But I know that there is a collection of some of the previous ones on Amazon, and I know this follows. I can't recall exactly which one was the first. I think it might have been Daredevil Yellow, maybe. It might have been, let's see, Daredevil Yellow, Spider-Man Blue, Hulk Gray were the ones that preceded these books, and they are each of them a Marvel Knights mini-series that sort of collects each of these stories. There's a volume called a collected volume that's available on Amazon called Yellow, Blue, and Gray that collects the 3. These creators, these 2 creators in particular, have worked on a number of books across DC and Marvel. I think if I were to pick out their absolute best story or best collaboration, I don't think it would be one of the Marvel books. I think it would probably perhaps be a book they wrote for DC Comics called Superman for All Seasons, which in my opinion is probably one of a small handful of some of the greatest Superman stories ever told. I think The Long Halloween is another one that people sort of love, right? I think people love Batman: The Long Halloween. They've done some stories, some tales of the Batman. I know there was some Darwin Cook. They've partnered up with Darwin. He's partnered up with Darwin Cook at some point. Tim Sale, when I say he, I mean Tim Sale. He's worked with Darwin Cook on a Superman story about sort of like the first appearance or the first time Superman encountered kryptonite. Loeb and Tim Sale previously teamed up on a Catwoman story called When in Rome that I think is about maybe a 6 or a 7 issue limited story. But the books are sort of known for their beautiful artwork and terrific storytelling. I mean, they are all some of the best stories out there. And this Captain America White, I think the interesting thing about this story is that it comes on the heels of the Avengers movies. So, prior to the Avengers movies, it wasn't necessarily, I think people's expectations that for Captain America, it seemed like, and this could just be my own opinion about this, but my experience with Captain America was that they didn't play much on the past. I think Kirby and Stan Lee in the Avengers stories, when Captain America first appeared in the Avengers stories in the 60s, and sort of the overarching the initial story of Captain America was dealing with how he was discovered by the Avengers and discovered in a block of ice, of course, and thawed out and was a man out of time. It dealt with Bucky Barnes. It dealt with the fact that the last that we saw of Bucky, retroed in was the story of Bucky's death and Captain America. Of course, later on, prior to the films, we got to see the Winter Soldier storyline, which delved a little bit into that dynamic of Steve Rogers and Bucky Barnes. But this story in particular really dives into Steve's guilt over the death of Bucky Barnes, right? I think, the first issue of this book sort of tells a lot about the dynamic of how Bucky and Cap met. It wasn't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily follow the movie, right? It doesn't follow the movie storyline in that Bucky and Cap were old friends prior to Cap getting the super soldier serum. So it tells a somewhat slightly different version of how Cap and Bucky came to be, and how Cap trained Bucky, and how Cap felt like Bucky was perhaps a little young, and as a result of that meeting and that dynamic in their relationship and how the relationship is formed, it starts to play into Steve's guilt over Bucky's death. Like Bucky was too young, maybe I didn't train him enough. So it's an interesting take. I'm not sure, well, of course you have an opportunity in this book as well to see Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos, and it's kind of funny to see how Sergeant Fury initially reacts to Captain America. But of course you have to kind of have that relationship, right? Sergeant is a grizzled veteran, and Cap is this sort of circus performer, right? So I think in the context of their meetings, and given the fact that Sergeant Fury has a lot of experience with war, right? I think you can understand the dynamic between the two of them, and then of course throw in Bucky, who in this storyline is definitely a young child compared to Captain America. They aren't peers. They aren't close in age, right? So they don't share the same connectedness, I guess, as the Bucky and the Cap in the movies. So this is an interesting take. I think it harkens back to the Joe Simon and Jack Kirby Captain America. I think that's definitely something that you is played up here. The idea that Captain America is much older than Bucky, and Bucky is a small child. But it's a great book, right? I think if you read the Daredevil Yellow, which by a huge margin, in my opinion, I think the Daredevil Yellow is the best story of sort of the four to date. Spider-Man Blue is an interesting take on Spider-Man, really sort of telling the story of Peter Parker's Peter Parker's love life, and then there's the Hulk Gray, which I think I've read it. I have the book, and I've probably read the story maybe once or twice. Certainly haven't gone back to it in the same way that I've gone back to Daredevil Yellow and Superman for All Seasons and some of the Batman The Long Halloween. I've read some of these books for multiple times. I've gone back and revisited these a lot, but this, I think, of all of the sort of four books that they've worked on together for the Marvel Knight series, I think this one might potentially be sort of the weakest of the bunch. The Hulk story is really good. I remember Spider-Man kind of stands out again because of the sort of the way that it sort of tells the story of Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane Watson and Peter Parker's love lives, and then of course the Daredevil Yellow is a reference to Daredevil's first costume before he became sort of old Hornhead, as he's known, with the red costume. This is in the very beginning of Daredevil. He's for the first, I guess, maybe 4 or 5 issues, he's wearing a yellow costume, and that's always sort of referred to as his early days when he's getting started as Daredevil. And it's a great sort of, it's almost like a Batman year one type story for Daredevil, which is really good. But by all means, I mean, like, you remember, you're talking about the weakest story, the weakest collection of books by Jeph, Loeb, and Tim Sale. I mean, that's sort of like saying the worst Paul McCartney and John Lennon team up, right? I mean, you're still going to get something that's orders of magnitude better than any story almost out there. So you owe it to yourself to probably bone up on these. And if it were me, I would go for the whole collection without a doubt. If you haven't read Daredevil Yellow, Spider-Man Blue, or Hulk Gray, or Captain America White, I would absolutely, definitely read those. And I think if I were going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, I think probably I would say number 1 is Daredevil, number 2 is probably Spider-Man Blue, number 3 is Hulk Gray, and then probably number 4 is Captain America White. I think if I were to read them in that order, so you could read from bottom to top and end on the number 1, or you could start with a bang and read number 1 and maybe work your way down. But if it were up to, I mean, if I were you, I would absolutely, without a doubt, not miss this at all. So I think it's definitely something that should be added to your bucket list. I think it's something that you should read if you haven't read it. And head on over to the website and take a look at the comic book of the day today. It's Captain America White, issue number 1, and it's over at comicbookoftheday.com. And remember, you can follow us along on Facebook. You can subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And we appreciate your time, and thanks for following along. This is the Comic Book of the Day podcast, and we will see you tomorrow.